Are we headed for a new ice age? The answer is maybe. Okay, well, you need to understand when people say trust the science and everything is that there isn't exactly consensus around all of the issues involving climate change, okay? Now, there's observations, there's data that we can all share in, and then there's assumptions and interpretations that happen, and those can be wrong. So you may have heard it called global warming and then it changed to climate change because that's more accurate. Let's step away from some of the interpretations and assumptions for a second and look at the observations. The observations are twofold. One, global average temperatures have risen about 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't seem to me that it matters much as whether or not we're causing it or if it's natural or some combination of the two. We're not going to stop being industrialized at a scale that's going to matter, and it's too late. So what we should focus on is mitigating the stuff that's going to happen, the sea level rise or whatever. Building seawalls, having people relocate to not low-lying areas. Invest in it now because it will cost exponentially more after these disasters happen, and they'll continue to happen. However, while right now temperatures on average are rising, and you can look at satellite maps of the ice up at the poles and see how much it's shrunk, and that year over year what's supposed to happen is that snow falls, it doesn't melt, and then it accumulates into glaciers. But what it's doing is melting and flowing into the ocean, and that's fresh water and it's cold water. So when that fresh water enters the ocean, it lowers the salinity, the amount of salt in the water, which changes the thermodynamics of the system, which is how temperatures affects things. Now there's this thing called the Gulf Stream, which is like a conveyor belt that takes warm water, warm rises, cold sinks from the Gulf of Mexico and the tropics, brings it all the way up over by Europe and in the poles. And that's why places like the UK aren't as cold as Siberia. That's the reason. But what we're seeing is that this thing is starting to slow down because of the change in salinity and the change in temperatures. And when it slows down to a certain critical point, and we're not exactly sure where that is, it can stop, which would drastically change the climate very quickly. Now, because we've attributed about 1 degree Celsius to what we're calling climate change now, the high end of the estimates, again, we don't know for sure, it hasn't happened yet, but the high end is several degrees of cooling on the average temperature. If that happened, the atmosphere would freak out and there'd be different storm patterns and the world would completely change. Places that are pretty nice now might be more or less uninhabitable. However, it may negate that 1 degree. If we have several degrees of warming, it may negate what we're doing as far as the rising and actually have an overall lowering effect, leading to, and it might take a number of years, that snow staying year after year and the glaciers coming back, which takes water out of the ocean, actually making the sea level decline instead of rise. This isn't a for sure thing, but it's just as possible as it not happening. Either way, the world's changing in our lifetimes and you should be prepared for it. You can do that at prepzone.org. Do me a favor, hit like. Yeah, this makes me think of an additional fascinating point, okay? So we talked about how if the Gulf Stream stops, that it could cause a new mini ice age, potentially. However, when we talk about global average temperatures rising or lowering, that's averaged for the whole globe. Different regions are going to experience different effects. So if the warm water in the Gulf was stopped from going up and warming up Europe, it's not so much about cold water. Cold water is not going to be moving either. It's not coming down there. What's going to happen is the heat, the energy that's in the system here in the Gulf is going to stay there instead of going to Europe, which means there's a lot more heat concentrated around the tropics here, okay? And that could make things pretty unpleasant among America's southern coast. They talk about places like Florida, Georgia, those kind of areas. They're already a swamp, but imagine them being like a lot hotter, like triple digits most of the time. That's very potentially what could happen. Very, very high humidity as well, like stifling levels of humidity could happen. And more importantly, mega superstorms, potentially all year round. What happens when we have hurricanes is that there's a lot of energy, a lot of heat in the water here, and heat causes evaporation, humidity, rain. So that's energy from the sun hitting the water, turning into storms, right? So the potential for like regular super hurricanes is very, very high if this happens. And so on one hand, if this doesn't happen, if the current doesn't stop, we don't get into an ice age, things keep warming, the ice keeps melting, sea level rise takes out Florida. And a lot of other places too. But even if the sea level doesn't rise or even lowers because it's getting locked up in ice, which would have its own slew of problems, it could just be like terrible there all the time. And these storms, they can come pretty far inland. They're going to like bigger than the biggest hurricanes now in this situation. And this kind of thing could happen easily within our lifetime. So I always advise people, Florida's not a great place. It's not a great place in general. It's probably not a great place for your long term. If you're buying land or something for your family, go a little more north, okay? Yeah, kind of Great Lakes region is where I would recommend for prepping in general, but especially for this kind of stuff. Either way, whichever you believe, whichever way you lean on the science, things aren't going to stay as they are. The climate's going to get more and more wild throughout our lifetimes. And your responsibility, your duty to yourself and your family is to be prepared for that. Because we know damn well, whatever the government may try to do to help will be insufficient and incompetent. It's up to you and your communities to be prepared. And you can get some help with that at prepzone.org. That's the mission here. It's just to help you get somewhat of a better outcome than if you did nothing and didn't get any help at all. You don't need to be scared if you're prepared. There's nothing to be afraid of then.